Good afternoon, everyone, and very welcome to this seminar hosted by the Nordic Development Fund. We are the joint Nordic fund for investments into development and climate, and we focus on the least developed countries and also in fragile states. What we do is that we provide early stage and catalytic financing and work with partners, both MDBs, but also partners in the private sector. So we're very, very happy to have this excellent panel here that will help me kick off the seminar. And as you know, the seminar is called Let's Talk About Adaptation. But we at the Nordic Development Fund, we are also very much about walk. So we hope that we will also walk the talk in this seminar. We will focus on challenges, and we will also then discuss and provide some solutions to these challenges. So we hope that what will come out of this seminar is something that is very concrete and also actionable. I'm Karin, the Managing Director of the Nordic Development Fund, and it's my great pleasure to welcome Ambassador Christensen to give the introductory words to this seminar. You are the climate ambassador at the Danish Ministry for Foreign Affairs. You have a long career within the ministry, but you have also worked within the UN system. So, as they say, without further ado, please take the stage and say a few introductory words to kick this off.
Thank you very much, Karin, and it's a pleasure to be with you and with the distinguished panelists on a day when the COP that we're at kicks into a different gear. Ministers have been arriving, and I'm just coming from a meeting that the High Ambition Coalition had with former President Obama, who will address the plenary in a few moments, and where the focus now is on making advances towards the end of the week on the combination of ambition on mitigation, keeping the 1.5 degree goal alive, but at the same time also on finance and on adaptation. Today is the adaptation day, and hopefully by the end of today we can have a much better overview over what countries in the north and in the south are ready to do on adaptation to strengthen their efforts. At the end of the week, we need a solid balance that everybody can recognize themselves in, but really this adaptation agenda is of utmost importance for the most vulnerable, for the poorest, for those who are suffering the most from climate change as it is happening. We know from the IPCC that it is not theory, it is the hard reality for millions, if not billions, of people around the planet already now. Every region across the globe is actually impacted by climate change and needs to move forward on adaptation. And that is to face the irreversible impact leading to weather extremes, heat waves, heavy precipitation, droughts, and tropical cyclones. So here in Glasgow, we need to show the world how we're going to act and how we can start adapting to the unavoidable climate change. That's why this panel is so relevant today. Adaptation will require climate-informed screening of public planning, of investments, and of course also of private investments. There's a whole train of work underway on that. And on the public side, we basically need to put our money where our mouth is, as they say. Denmark bilaterally has pledged to increase our grant-based climate finance to a total of $500 million annually by 2023, but also with that then to mobilize more than 1% of the 100 billion in finance. With that comes the commitment to dedicate at least 60% of our public grants for adaptation efforts. We have heeded the call of the UN Secretary General And we have taken lead on creating a group of champions on adaptation that counts also Sweden, Netherlands, Ireland, the UK, Germany, Finland, and hopefully more. And with this group, we now also, with the hack, are calling for those who have not yet done so to actually double their investments into adaptation. And we hope that that language that we have crafted with the High Ambition Coalition might also serve as a bridge and as a platform to achieve consensus by the end of the week. Just one final word on the private financing. It is clear that bringing private finance to the table, blending through guarantees and other measures is critical for mitigation. That is where private finance is focused, but we really need to explore also how to attract private capital to adaptation and to invest into resilience in both green and grey infrastructure. Because we need to, this is really a situation for all hands on deck, where we also owe it to the most vulnerable communities to have our support. We can leave no one behind. Thank you very much, Karin.
Thank you, and thank you very much for speaking with a strong Nordic voice on the area of adaptation, which is also within the climate finance core area for NDF, where we are trying to channel at least 50% of our financing to adaptation projects. I think that you are a very busy person today, so after this very highly appreciated introduction, we wish you a pleasant day, and we will focus on the panel now. You are all partners of NDF, and the strategic partnerships for NDF is also key to our operating model to complement, to co-create, and to convene around climate finance projects. And here we have put together a panel where we will get to some extent diverse views on how to address climate adaptation projects from the public sector prospect, but also from the private sector, from the enabling environment perspective, and also on how to, not least, to co-create projects around adaptation. So we will kick off with a round where I will ask this distinguished panel to identify some challenges that they see in the climate adaptation space. And after this, we will have a discussion on possible solutions. And as I said, it's not just about talk, it's about walk the talk. So hopefully after this short panel, we will also have a possibility to summarize some actionable interventions where we can work together. Because alone, we cannot achieve what we are set out to achieve. We need to join forces. So I will now start with Barbara and introduce you. You are from the Climate Policy Initiative, and that has been very, very important in monitoring global climate finance flows, but also you are heading the Climate Lab, from which many very interesting projects has come out. So you are in a position to share with us your thoughts on some challenges. So what do you think are the most visible challenges from your perspective?
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Karin, for having me here, and it's a true pleasure being here with this distinguished panel. Yeah, I think at my organization, CPI, we have been looking really on how much money is flowing, and I think the biggest challenge, obviously, we do see, and we've just published our latest global climate finance landscape, is that while there have been constant increases across all types of investors in climate investments, adaptation is still lagging behind. I think there's a number of challenges for that. One is having the right metrics and the right language and actually understanding better the impact of adaptation. We might hear more of that from the panel. But I think, again, I do want to remind everyone here, out of our latest figures, which is around 630 billion US dollars of global public and private investment, only 7% go towards adaptation finance. Again, it is due to methodologies, but it also is due to a lack of real action. So for me, the biggest challenge is how to unlock private investment, doing that by using public capital, including from NDF, and I think you've been a pioneer in this area, more effectively and more wisely to really kind of come up with the right business models. And so for me, challenge one is the scale, but the related challenge is really having the right business models, the right financial instruments that allocate basically the risks across public and private actors more effectively to really enable investments at scale into adaptation.
Thank you very much. And in essence, your challenge, then if I just for us to remember to summarize, to unlock private capital also by providing the efficient financial structures to have them join forces with us, then providing public capital. So thank you very much, Barbara. I now turn to Amal-Lee. You are now with the CDC group as the head of climate policy, and previously with a long career within, among other things, the IDB. We are very much looking forward to hear you and to share with us your perspective on the top challenges.
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation to be here. This is working? Yeah. And in fact, today we're delighted that actually NDF is joining us and 14 other institutions, financial institutions, both DFIs, MDBs, and other bilateral development banks, to look at, to come together, exactly as you said, to co-create, to convene, and critically collaborate to overcome market barriers to increasing private investment in adaptation and resilience. So we launched this initiative a year ago at the Financing Commons Summit in Paris, and it has been growing over the past 12 months, and delighted that NDF, along with some other partners, are joining today. And the reason we launched this initiative is because we do see a lot of need, a very critical and urgent need for the types of technologies and solutions that businesses, particularly small businesses, small, medium-sized enterprises, will need to bring to all sectors, all communities, to enable adaptation to climate impacts and provide those services that will enable resiliency. And yet, these business opportunities are very often, where they exist, are very, very small scale, very early stage, and really we need really collectively to overcome a number of market barriers. I often say that we're potentially where we were on renewable energy maybe 20 years ago in terms of really seeing a lot of barriers to and very high costs and a lot of risk and uncertainty. And that's kind of where we are now in many cases. So through this collaborative, we're looking to overcome these barriers and focus in three main areas. We've had, there are 3 working groups. The first one is to look at what metrics are really needed, what are the relevant metrics for investors. As Barbara referred to, the adaptation finance and the methodology for tracking that takes quite a conservative and a granular approach to assess the amount of finance for adaptation. But this is really an input metric. It's not assessing the extent to which those projects or those investments are actually really delivering adaptation over the medium and longer term in particular, and the extent to which they're really ensuring resiliency both of that project, that asset, but also critically contributing to a more systemic resilience. The second working group is focused on looking at how do we how can we work together to develop really a common toolkit or guidance notes around how we assess physical climate risk of our projects, of our investments through our due diligence process, moving beyond where we are now, which is looking in some cases where a project is very clearly risky, then we would do a full physical climate risk assessment. But in many cases, actually, projects are sort of could be slipping under where we're not actually really doing that assessment as much as we will need to. And then the third area is really around co-creation for investments. And we very much appreciate NDF joining the collaborative, because I know from my work at IDB with NDF that you've been really leading the way on private sector adaptation for many years now. So very much looking forward to the continued collaboration in that respect.
Thank you very much. And also interesting to note that you, as well as Barbara, talked about the metrics and the methodology, which is one side of the coin. And on the area of crowding in private sector, I heard a slightly different angle, and not talking so much of the big money flows, but also to crowd in the solutions from the private sector. Mm-hmm. Very interesting. I'm sure we have a very nice dialogue on solutions also when we get to that. So, Jay, nice to have you here. You are the founder and the managing partner of Lightsmith, who also manages the private equity, the Impact Investment Fund, the Craft Fund, one of the very first funds to focus on adaptation and the private sector. I'm very much looking forward to hear from you on what you see as the top priority challenges to address.
Thank you so much, Karin. It's really wonderful to be here, especially at the Nordic Pavilion. The CRAFT strategy, as Karin mentioned, is the Climate Resilience and Adaptation Finance and Technology Transfer Facility, and has been really a product, obviously, of the Global Innovation Lab for Climate Finance, but without the support from the very beginning of the NDF to help ideate and launch the strategy, and then to scale it up, and now move forward even into, we'll talk about solutions, bringing that as quickly as possible to low-income countries and SIDS. It really has been a terrific partnership, so we really very much appreciate the NDF's engagement here. We think it's a real leader, and we'll talk about some of the ways that those designs have worked going forward. In terms of challenges, from the private sector side, so Lightsmith is a private investment firm focused on adaptation and climate resilience. It's one of the first strategies in this area. I'd say there's two barriers that we really see that are the primary ones right now. So the former barrier used to be if and when. If climate change will happen, and when will it happen? And so then when do we really need to deal with the adaptation and climate resilience impacts that are going to be happening coming forward? We are now in a situation where the question isn't if or when. It will happen, there's no if, and it is happening and will continue to happen now at an accelerating rate. I think that recognition now is extremely clear. IPCC 6AR6 and the Secretary General have called it Code Red for humanity. So this is now going to happen. 1.5 degrees is the baseline, and be extremely difficult to keep us at that level or close to it. So it's not a question of if or when, the question is now how. What does adaptation mean? And to the private sector, that's a very large word with not a lot of very clear definition around it. So identifying where are the specific sets of technologies and solutions that can generate the outcomes that can then be measured. In which sectors, in water, in agriculture, in the supply chain, in the built environment, in energy, in financial services, even in healthcare. We're now seeing the first emergence of real complications, not just of disease-borne vectors, but respiratory ailment compounding the impact of climate. When you light everything on fire, you have dramatically more impact like this. So the private sector is interested, I think as well as the public sector, in defining how. How are their solutions? How do we move forward? And hopefully moving from that question of how into how much. How much more capital can we then raise? How much more action can we then generate? And how do we actually measure the impact of that? So I think that's the primary challenge for the public-private interface right now is how do you do this? What are the definitions of kinds of business models, of solutions and technologies that can move forward? Very briefly, the second major challenge that we see right now is time. We don't have any more time. And so aligning the speed of the private sector, which wants to engage and generate technology and innovation and entrepreneurship, with the speed of some of the public sector decision making, where you can have blending of finance, but not necessarily blending of timescales, is an incredibly critical challenge. And without that same sense of urgency and cooperative dynamic, then the mismatch in being able to not just speak the same language, but to take action at the same time. If you're stepping forward with 1 foot slowly and 1 foot quickly, it's very hard to coordinate forward process. So I think that's a really major question right now. So the how and how much question, and then the time alignment question, these are two critical challenges we see today.
Thank you very much. Interesting, and really interesting to hear this joint, common, but also slightly diverse perspective. And you touched upon something that is also very close to NDF, and that is the co-benefits of working together with the public and the private sector. So I now turn to Arghya, and you are from the ADB. And working in the climate finance space, we have a project together, the Community Resilience Project that was launched this morning. So please share with us, from your perspective, the biggest challenges in the adaptation space.
Sure, thanks Karin very much, and thanks for organizing this event, having us here. I think from our point of view, the biggest challenge on adaptation is climate risk is systemic in nature, and we need system-wide responses for adaptation. Let me just unpack what I mean by system-wide responses. One is, climate risk transmits through various channels, from national to local level, from national to global level, across sectors and administrative levels. So for example, a poor farmer in Vietnam which grows coffee, and in the future, because of changing temperature, if that coffee is not going to be any more suitable, it's not only the farmer who will be affected, even people living in Europe who drink that coffee will be affected. So it's very systemic. Secondly, I think it's also issue is climate risk interacts with your socioeconomic existing vulnerabilities. So for a rural woman in Cambodia living in the Mekong region, she is vulnerable not just because she is located in a hazard-prone area, but equally because she may not have access to land or access to information because of gender norms. So I think this interaction of risk and underlying vulnerability makes it even more complicated. And last but not the least is this longer term but uncertainty. I mean, in coastal areas in Bangladesh, many towns, they know they might have to relocate, or they know they should not be investing in more, but they don't know exactly when to stop. And I think that makes decision making very, very difficult. So I think for us, the system-wide approach required for adaptation is critical, but it's very, very difficult to operationalize. And for me, that's the biggest challenge which we need to sort.
Yep. Thank you very much, and to some extent still bordering on what Jay said about the interaction between the public and the private sector, but also you stress the complexity of the issue and having to address it in a comprehensive way. Very, very interesting as well. Now actually we will turn to discuss the solutions, and as I said, hopefully we can then land on something that is actionable. And we at NDF, we are prepared to be part of that action, as you know. So actually, why don't I start with you again, Arghya, and then we will see where we end up in trying to get to the common denominator to some extent. So what was your solutions?
So I think the biggest solution is a change in mindset, where we don't look at adaptation as an add-on or additionality to development. I mean, understanding of climate risk has to inform every single decision making and help steer development towards a resilient direction. So, for example, if I want to invest in a bridge in a small island developing country, I should not be designing the bridge first and then thinking about, so how do I make the bridge proof from flood proof or sea level rise, etc. I would rather look at sea level rise and flood data to begin with, and then decide, is this bridge really needed? how can we make the bridge safer, but not only the bridge, because of the bridge, are there other investment going to come in the same area which may not be so much viable in the future. So we have to really shift from the thinking about climate adaptation being an additional factor, looking at additional costs, but how do you start designing projects and programs based on adaptation? So I mean, that's one of the solutions. And the second solution I would say is equally about so we often say we are doing an adaptation project where our sole emphasis is on the final output that we are financing. But adaptation is much more than the output. It's actually very much a learning process. So the amount of learning goes in it, the capacity building goes in it, the institutional strengthening, all of it is equally, I would argue, is perhaps more important than the final output that we get. So I think we need to redefine what we call as adaptation projects to ensure financing not only goes for that hard infrastructure bit of it, but equally about the soft elements which are required to make that infrastructure functioning in a long-term process. So for me, these two are the possible solutions moving forward.
Yeah. Thank you very much, and I'm also hearing your view on adaptation not being anything that is just on the side, but integrated everything, and also taking into consideration when designing, because adaptation makes also, from a financial point of view, sense. You can mitigate the risks and the costs that are related with the risks. So, Barbara, maybe if you have some sort of reflections also, maybe from your perspective on what we just heard, and then we will continue with your particular challenge about crowding in financing flows for adaptation projects. Please.
Thank you so much, and I think really excellent contributions here, and I very much agree actually with the need for a change in the mindset. I think this is important for climate in general, but even more important for the adaptation area. So really kind of integrating climate risk into any decision making from the beginning, I think, will be fundamental to really put also adaptation on the level playing field with other opportunities. So I fully agree with that one. I think it's extremely important, and I really think we need to. We've had another panel on adaptation finance earlier today, where we were actually thinking, okay, we need to rethink the invisible hand of the economies, of the finance system, and really kind of make sure that we integrate it. It's not an add-on. It's supposed to be really mainstreamed into each decision that everyone is taking. So fully subscribe to that one. My other solution is, I do want to be concrete here, because I feel this lab that you have mentioned and also Jay has mentioned, really kind of thinking about ways you can test and demonstrate some of the concrete investment opportunities, some of the concrete projects, the financial structures that work to crowd in private investment. And so at my organization, CPI, we are running this Global Innovation Lab for Climate Finance now since over 7 years. And the lab is really meant to bring together the different parts of the finance ecosystem. So really we have lab members from the public sector, development finance institutions, to the private sector, from commercial banks to institutional investors, and very trusted partners such as NDF. And the goal is really to unlock private investment at scale by crowdsourcing ideas. There's so many ideas out there on how to actually channel money into adaptation and mitigation, and then helping to develop these ideas from an earlier concept stage, from a great idea like Jay's, to it become a bankable project, and really using the ecosystem of over 70 lab members and over 300 financial experts that are part of the lab to really then help get the funding to these instruments and really demonstrate them. And again, just in a nutshell, we have developed 55 business models and financial instruments, many of them in adaptation. In going very granular, we heard that as well, like thinking about agriculture, about food systems, about really kind of providing more information on these areas. And they have collectively mobilized more than $2.6 billion. So there is a pipeline. What we need now is, however, to make sure that we go from the pilots that we're developing to really scale. How can we replicate them most quickly? How can we use a more programmatic approach, like more holistic approach, to really ensure that there is the financial models in the pipeline for investors to really kind of scale their activities in the adaptation space. And again, particularly in the adaptation area, I just want to stress that again, having concessional money, having public money and used that really effectively, I think is fundamental to really demonstrate, test, using also existing instruments. It's not that it's innovation means everything needs to be new. No, there is a lot of instruments and approaches that are used in other parts of the economies that can be applied to adaptation and resilience space. So I think doing more of that is great. And again, Jay might talk more about some of the specific ways of scaling, but I think just want to stress that there is a pipeline of investments, but we've got to demonstrate them in order to kind of really make sure we get them to scale.
Thank you very much. I think this is an excellent bridge over to you, Amal-Lee, to talk about how to incubate the business solutions and how to bring them into the market. If you like to comment a bit on that, but then of course focus on your own challenges and provide your solutions.
Yeah, so I think this is really the key challenge with what we're seeing is that these businesses are very, they need a lot of incubation and then acceleration. We're fortunate actually just, so FCDO, who is our sole shareholder, have recently given us 40 million funding, which is really for innovative climate solutions.
Great.
And we will hopefully be having a further 200 million over the next 5-year strategy period to do exactly these sorts of very early stage innovative types of businesses. And we actually, through the pilot, the 40 million is the pilot, the 200 million the follow-on, we've actually already, just before coming here actually, we already made our first investment with one of the investees already in our portfolio, which a company providing, looking at using data more effectively from smallholder farmers to then partner with microinsurance to provide insurance for climate-related risks and impacts. So, and this was, combining fintech with a company that was already engaging on many of these areas. And this is actually, it's actually we actually have another investment that we made earlier this year in similar, a crop in, not providing looking at insurance, but providing, again, data analytics to farmers. That actually, in that case, where we made an investment with, so kind of a venture capital investment from our perspective, but actually that company had already benefited quite a lot from philanthropic funding as well. So, these sorts of resources, more grant that can be converted into equity, venture capital, these types of resources we see as really necessary to really get these business solutions to the stage in which, a DFI might normally finance them.
Thank you, and also interesting to hear how you touched upon the complementarity of different players with different risk-return profiles and how to try to optimize how we use our financing.
So that's exactly what we're hoping to do a lot more of through the collaborative as we look to COP27. I actually think that we should be thinking about creating a kind of a platform that can provide this kind of very early stage finance, but also I think, and I know Arghya, you were talking about it, particularly on infrastructure, but I think also businesses, all businesses are also going to need ongoing support to ensure that they are integrating climate risk and developing their own adaptation plans and strategies. And these, when working with small businesses, it's very hard as a DFI to be able to do that effectively. But I believe we probably need to create a dedicated platform with dedicated expertise that can really provide the finance, but also the technical assistance to both at the beginning, at the early stage, but also over the course of the investment.
Thank you very much. Jay, I'm a little bit curious if you could try to address the question on the comprehensive approach towards adaptation, and if when you probably assess many business opportunities within the fund that you're managing, do you see that this is a mindset that is becoming more and more sort of encompassing among companies and also outside your fund? Is this the way that companies now start to think?
I think it's a great question, and if you pick up the point on a systemic approach and embedding climate assumptions, not just risk but opportunity assumptions, into projects, into government planning, into corporate planning, into community planning, individual planning, and this kind of platform approach that Amal-Lee's talking about in the context of still very limited amounts of flow of funding that Barbara's identified, then where we see this come together is that there's a need to build and identify and build that ecosystem. So we do think there's a lot of early stage innovation that needs to happen. There's also a lot of existing companies and technologies and solutions that need to be identified. So one of the things that we're very proud to be a partner of the NDF on is the Adaptation Solutions Taxonomy, which is to try to take the EU Sustainable Finance Taxonomy and other sources and to downscale it effectively to SMEs. So we need to identify which SMEs are actually doing adaptation. Most of them wouldn't call what they do adaptation or climate resilience, but if they're working in agricultural analytics, if they're like the company that Amal-Lee's mentioning, if they're working in water and hydrology analysis, if they're working in supply chain management, where there's now weather shocks compounding across the COVID impact on the supply chain, or if they're looking at disaster mitigation through catastrophe risk modeling or weather analytics, all of those companies need to be identified and understood and to have that understanding be transmitted to them that they are actually doing adaptation, can support both the public and private sector in providing that risk analysis and data in a consistent way. So I think that's one major innovation. In terms of the second piece of it, that answers to the sort of like, how do you do this question? And then the how much question, it's about instruments again, and that's why we're so proud to be a partner in the craft strategy with the Nordic Development Fund, which is scaling up through combinations of multilateral, philanthropic, and private sector capital, the first strategies to invest around climate resilience and adaptation, and to prove out that these companies are there and they have customers that are using that technology for what will become an embedded approach, which I think is at the early stages, but slowly getting in that direction to embedding this mentality of what do I do now? Because what the recognition that's occurring is in the public and private sector that the climate future is now the climate present, right? So maybe 5 years ago, you were having the beginnings of an understanding that fire was going to be a problem, but it was always about sea level rise and flooding, maybe drought. Now, after the last 5 years, at least in California, where you have permanent wildfire seasons, this year's impacts on the fire side here in Europe, but then also the fact that you could choose which continent you could have flooding incidents in May, June, July of this year, most of which usually don't hit the headlines in developed countries, but are the kind of common experience, unfortunately, of a lot of Asia, a lot of developing Africa, a lot of the low-income countries in particular. That mentality is now becoming a reality for business leaders and for investors. Now, converting that from the risk side of it to the opportunity side, that's a really important question. That's how you align capital going forward, and to do that hand in hand between the public and private sector, so the signal is very clear that these tools will be used going forward, whether you're building a private port or a public port, whether you're trying to secure a community through a combination of funding from the government side and also technology from the private sector side, those are the conversations that need to happen. So NDF's approach in terms of helping to support that blending, helping to support the crowding into the private sector, I think is really a wonderful example of this. Our big news here was the Green Climate Fund approving an additional up to 100 million of commitment to help scale up the craft strategy. And then on top of that, the US government, State Department announcing $2.5 million, which side by side with the Nordic Development Fund's 1.5 million euros, really activates a technical assistance facility to bring that technology, when it can't be expanded on a commercial investment basis, as fast as possible to LICs, SIDS, and vulnerable populations. And so to answer that second question about challenges, the timing question, I think this is the challenge we all face right now. I would applaud NDF in being really a quick actor in this. The first grant to launch the craft strategy announced here in 2017, and then first close of the first commitment approvals in 2018, first close of the fund 2019, all by NDF, the first fastest investor, and now the scaling up of the strategy 2021. These are examples of how you can blend that funding over time to really scale things up. What I would say to your question about comprehensiveness is we need early stage support, we need innovation, we need scaling at the mid stage and larger cap stage, and we need, unfortunately, all of those things to happen at the same time now because we're out of time. So being able to pull that technology into LICs faster through grants, when commercial strategies still need to be proved out, that's something we need to do. And all we can do to actually, make louder the call to action by the Secretary General, this kind of code red, and to make concrete and to scale the technology in adaptation and climate resilience, that's the focus that we have now. Amal-Lee talked about COP27. we've had this conversation many times. When my 5-year-old daughter is 15, we'll hopefully have made a lot more progress by COP36. And the entire universe of adaptation will have become much more concrete, much more hopefully systemic and integrated. And to see a world that we're going to live in that has healthcare changes, agriculture changes, water changes, supply chain changes, that's the challenge that we face right now. So those are the questions we should be asking is how do we drive towards that outcome as fast as we can across as many stages that we can. And I think flexibility in instruments is a critical way to do that.
Thank you very much. And now has come the time for me to try to summarize this very exciting discussion and dialogue that we had. And I said at the outset that let's try to be actionable. And I hope by listening to us that you get the sense that we do really act and that we act together and that we are guided by the co-create, convene and complement. So at least an attempt to summarize. First, we heard about the timing and the urgency. And that, of course, is something that is much more easy to address when we are working together, we know one another, and we can co-create quite quickly. We also heard about the need to bring in complementary financing into projects to address the different risk-return perspective. So complement is another word that will guide us. Then convene. This is what we're doing right now. We are convening around and discussing. And a lot of interesting thoughts has come out of this. And I can just say, I'm very happy to have you as partners, all of you. And let's walk the talk. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.